Hey, remember those who told you before the election that you don't have to worry about Trump because America has separation of power? That didn't age very well, did it? Actually, way before the Trump era, a lot of scholars, including some ex scholars like me, already believed that separation of power didn't really exist. I mean, we did observe something that looked like a separation power, people staying in their lanes, but that was only because the voters normally selected the type of presidential candidates who had some shame. It was not because the presidents weren't able to break the law. It was because the voters were careful enough not to select the type of presidents who loves to break the law in the first place. So it was not the separation of power that kept things going. It was because the median voters had a type. Even if some of the presidents were just pretending that they respected the law, but at least they had to somehow keep up their image. You can't just make a personality U-turn right after the election. That would be really awkward and you would end up losing all your popularity. So again, it was not the other branches that constrained the presidents. It was the voters' taste. So can you imagine what would happen if voters decided to give up their tastes and chose someone who advertises himself as a proud criminal or even a proud sex criminal? Well, actually, you don't have to imagine because it already happened. I don't know what the fuck people were thinking, but it happened. So the moment the voters decided to grant that guy the power to break the law, he started to do just that immediately. There's no institutional constraints good enough to prevent a president who campaigns as a lawbreaker from further breaking the law. Zero. Why? The answer is simple. The president can fire people, while the legislators and the judges can't. He's the only person who controls the career prospects of thousands of high-level federal employees, as well as the millions of subordinates of the said employees. Which also means he controls the tools of violence. Elon's teenagers can break into the government agencies. Why? Because the security guards would be fired if they try to stop them. Trump can defy court rulings. Why? Because any US Marshals officers who try to enforce those rulings would be fired. One day someone may even press those nuclear buttons because they don't want to get fired. So American voters happen to have selected a guy who loves both activities, breaking the law and firing people. You can't do worse than that. So there's no separation of power anymore. That's exactly what was planned in the Project 2025. And the median voters somehow just decided to give it a try because, they couldn't get laid or whatever. That was crazy. I should mention another reason that inflates the presidential power beyond what's said in the Constitution: the attention the president commands. Even if the president of a country doesn't have as much constitutional power as the US president does, their voters probably still pay more attention to the presidential elections than the legislative elections because it's easy. It's like an information shortcut. You only have to learn about this one person. Voters are busy, right? The presidential candidate has more interviews, more rallies, more social media followings, more TikTok sound bites than any other candidates. And that attention is power. A legislative candidate would be thrilled if they're invited to a presidential campaign rally. Where else can it get the attention? In political science jargon, this is called the coattail effect. The presidential candidate drags his legislative allies into power with his long coattail because of the disproportional attention he enjoys. And guess what? If anyone can take advantage of that attention, it's Donald. He not only enjoys breaking the law and firing people, but at the same time, he's also an attention whore. That was not a derogatory term, by the way. I'm one of those too. I'm just trying to illustrate why a president is so hard to constrain if he doesn't have self-constraint. And there's no one who fits that no self-constraint profile better than Donald. How did other countries manage that problem? Well, other countries also have self-cues. As far as I know, there's no clear answer from political scientists on how to prevent the president from breaking the law. Presidents are just too powerful. There may be a long-term fix, which is to switch to something called a parliamentary system. But unfortunately, not a single presidential system so far made the switch, because to have a major reform like that, you will need broad consensus. And people in presidential systems normally don't even know what the heck a parliamentary system is. How do you get that consensus? And even if people wanted to make that change, the politicians probably wouldn't cooperate. Because if your entire electoral machinery is invested in presidential politics, why would you want to give it up and start from scratch? So what's good about a parliamentary system? Well, the best part of such a system is that there's no job security for the top executive. A majority of the parliament can fire the prime minister anytime they want. Yes, the prime minister can fire other people just like a president does, but he himself can also be fired. The parliament doesn't have to wait for him to break the law or something. They can just say, we don't support you anymore. We're tired of your face. So just get your ass out of the 10 Downing Street or whatever office you're occupying. It's like no-fault divorce. Super easy. Well, actually even easier than divorce, because the parliament doesn't have to pay the prime minister a severance or whatever. I mean, it's still costly in a way because the governing party or the governing coalition may suffer some reputational cost by removing their own leaders. But it's not nearly as costly as removing a president. I'm not saying a prime minister is always constrained. Viktor Orban of Hungary is also a prime minister, but he somehow convinced the parliamentary majority to never remove him. Erdogan of Turkey used to be a prime minister, but one day he felt it wasn't good enough, so he managed to change the country into a presidential system and made himself a president. So a self-cue is still doable in a parliamentary system, but it's much harder because the PM has to make sure a majority of the parliament is totally behind him. In most cases, a parliamentary majority would not be thrilled about a hardcore dictatorship because they are worried that the new dictator may start purging them. If they feel any kind of personal danger, they will not play along. Even someone like Viktor Orban, if one day he starts to execute a whole bunch of people, he's probably gonna get fired. But you can't say the same about Trump. So by the way, what about Hitler? You probably remember he started off as a chancellor, which is another name for prime minister. How did he get the unlimited power? Well, keep in mind, Weimar Germany was not a parliamentary system. It was like a hybrid system with both a president and a prime minister. And the president was the number one constitutionally. In fact, Hindenburg actually defeated Hitler in the presidential election in 1932. Hitler only became the chancellor because Hindenburg appointed him. And he only became unconstrained because Hindenburg gave him the emergency power after the Reichstag fire. So strictly speaking, President Hindenburg was the one who started the coup by declaring emergency. Hitler didn't even have that power. Then history played a little trick on us. Shortly after declaring emergency, the sucker died in office. So Hitler just conveniently combined the presidency and the chancellorship into one job, the Führer. So the moral of the story is that Hitler didn't have to convince the whole parliament to get what he wanted. He only had to dope one person, the president. You see what I mean? He was the dictator, but the president was the one who made it possible. If Hitler had been a chancellor in a pure parliamentary system without a powerful president, he would not have been able to do what he did, because the parliament probably would have fired him before he could even try declaring emergency. So in my view, a parliamentary system would be the best safeguard against the kind of self-coup that Donald and Elon are trying to do. It's kind of ironic that the American founding fathers invented presidency exactly to prevent power abuse. James Madison made it pretty clear in the Federalist Papers that he wanted an executive branch independent to the legislative branch instead of being its subordinate. I don't blame him. There wasn't any previous case of an elected president, and there were hardly any elections at all at the time, so there was no way for him to compare different systems empirically. Only centuries later did political scientists finally start to realize that presidents are actually way more dangerous than parliaments. And one significant constraint to the power of any legislative body is the time it takes for them to make decisions. They need to deliberate and vote, and they need to come up with certain rules to divide up the discussion time and voting time among different topics. That whole process is unbearably slow, and that time factor made them pretty powerless compared to the one-person president. Trump can raise tariffs on Canada in just 5 minutes if he wants, and he can fire a cabinet member with a phone call or even a tweet. How long does it take for the US Congress to make a single decision, let alone a coup? And to plan a coup, you need some sort of secrecy. How does a whole legislature keep a secret like that? You need to make sure all these representatives elected from different parts of the country keep their mouths shut. It would not be easy. So if I had to say, I would make every country in the world a parliamentary system. No exception. Having an extra presidency will make the parliament more constrained, sure, but the overall risk is much higher because the president can become a sticky piece of shit that's impossible to remove. Also, if you happen to live in a presidential system, whether it's Brazil or Argentina or Indonesia or Taiwan or South Korea or Nigeria or Zambia or whatever, you have to learn the lesson. You have to never vote for a narcissistic motherfucker like Donald. It would be like an institutional suicide.